Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. The writer of Luke's Gospel likes to pair stories, people, even words or ideas. Sometimes they're placed together in harness like a pair of oxen pulling a plow, while other times they're juxtaposed, providing textural contrast and nuance and giving us something to chew on. We have a significant contrast between the story of the Samaritan and the injured traveler and the story of Martha and Mary, but both of them are grounded in the greatest commandment, the command to love the Most High God with all our heart, all our soul, all our strength, and all our mind, and to love our neighbor as ourself. God gave the commandments and the whole of the law, not for God's sake and not for the sake of the individual, but for the sake of the neighbor, for the sake of the community. God's law doesn't exist to keep us in line or even so that we know what to do to stay right with God. It exists so that those who are in need are cared for. The commandments are the framework for discipleship, the radical obedience to which Jesus calls us. And the foundation of our discipleship are these two commandments. Love God. Love your neighbor. The expert on the law in our gospel text for today wants to know who they are supposed to love beyond God and themselves. This isn't unreasonable. We all want to know who we are supposed to love and what that love is supposed to look like. And I think we all secretly long for the real answer to be the safe answer. For our neighbors to be the people who don't threaten our privilege, our assumptions about how the world works. And so when we retell this parable in our society, we take the sting out of it. Think about the label Good Samaritan, someone who does something charitable for someone else. Full stop. Good Samaritan laws protect people from prosecution or civil liability if they attempt to provide assistance during an emergency and things go sideways. Hospitals, senior living facilities, and charitable organizations carry the name Good Samaritan. There's even an international organization of RV owners called Good Sam. But those are all a pretty significant watering down of the original impact that this parable would have had on the lawyer. In Jesus' day, the Jericho Road was infamous for being particularly dangerous. It was 17 or 18 miles long and had a pretty steep decline, and it was a good place for bandits to lie in wait for travelers and catch them unawares. The traveler in Jesus' parable happens to be one of them. We don't know anything about this person. We don't know race or ethnicity, religious identity, wealth or poverty status, profession, and I think that's intentional. When the details are missing, we all bring our own likenesses to the stories we hear. So the lawyer would have assumed that the traveler was Jewish, possibly even of a similar profession or social class, robbed of everything and left for dead on the side of the road. Jesus sums up in 2 sentences the actions of the priest and the Levite, the temple worker. They both cross to the other side of the road and continue on their way. We don't know why, although footnotes in the Jewish New Testament do make clear that there is no concern for ritual purity at play here. The editors of that book assume that Jewish concern for respectful treatment of the dead would have come into play even though the traveler was still alive, and this would have outweighed any need for ritual purity. However, they're both on their way down from Jerusalem, headed away from the temple, and any religious duties that would call for them to be ritually clean. Whatever reasons the priest and the Levite have for bypassing the traveler are strictly personal. Perhaps they're afraid that they might be the next victims of the bandits, or maybe they're worried about being tainted somehow by associating with the victim of a violent crime. After all, it's all too easy to fall into the trap of victim blaming, to put some distance between ourselves and any horrible thing that we see. If only he hadn't been alone on the Jericho road, they might be thinking. We're all too familiar with that line of thought. Early hearers of this story would have expected to hear the priest and the Levite followed by a scribe or another influential member of Israelite society. To hear the twist on the parable, to hear that the third person who comes along is a Samaritan, would have been truly shocking. For those of you who were here on Ash Wednesday, this will probably sound familiar, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of the third person being Samaritan. When Israel split into two kingdoms around 900 BCE, the kings of the northern kingdom, whose capital was Samaria, prevented their people from going to Jerusalem in the southern kingdom to worship. Instead, they promoted worship on Mount Gerizim. Over time, even though both the Jews and the Samaritans worshiped the same God, they developed different traditions, different worship practices, even different versions of the same sacred texts. The action in the parable slows way down with the arrival of the Samaritan. As opposed to the 50 words Jesus spends on the priest and the Levite together, he uses 90 words to describe the actions of the Samaritan. The Samaritan doesn't hesitate to stop. Instead, filled with compassion, the Samaritan dresses the wounds and takes the traveler directly to an inn, paying for the person's room and board and promising to reimburse the innkeeper for any additional expense. And then Jesus asks the unexpected question. The lawyer had asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Based on that, we might think that Jesus' question to the lawyer would be, who realized that the injured traveler was a neighbor? But that's not the question. The question is, who was the neighbor to the traveler? It might sound like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. I can see someone on the side of the road and say, that's my neighbor. That's Betsy or Phil or Jackie or Darren. I'd better stop and help. Or I can see someone on the side of the road and say, that person's in trouble. I'd better stop and help. And I can be a neighbor to them. The ones who are in need are the ones who are our neighbors. And the Samaritan was the one who recognizes this and acts accordingly. But when Jesus asked the lawyer who was the neighbor to the traveler, they can't quite form the word Samaritan. Can't quite bridge that cultural and religious divide, can't get past the issue of heresy. It breaks all the lawyer's unwritten rules for the Samaritan to be the one showing compassion. And it breaks all kinds of barriers and rules for the Samaritan to stop and help a Jew. And it doesn't take much of a mental leap to understand that if the Samaritan stops to help a Jew, then Jesus surely expects the lawyer to stop and help a Samaritan in a similar circumstance. Our neighbors are not defined by religion, by education level, by income, by race, by anything that divides us. Our neighbors are defined only by the need they have and our willingness to see it. The second story in this morning's gospel text is very different from the parable of the Samaritan and the traveler. It has a different feel to it. It sits differently with us because Jesus chides Martha in a way that sometimes makes us feel uncomfortable. There's an element of hospitality, of welcome and care in this story that calls to mind the compassion that the Samaritan provides to the traveler. It also echoes back to the Pharisee who invited Jesus home for dinner in chapter 7 of Luke's gospel, then neglected to offer the basic hospitality of water to wash his feet, leaving that to the woman who washed Jesus' feet with her tears. And that hospitality is Martha's responsibility. Luke tells us that this is her home. She is the homeowner. Mary, her younger sister, lives with her. As the dependent family member of the homeowner, Mary's responsibility is to assist in the tasks of hospitality. But Mary makes a different choice. She chooses to sit at Jesus' feet and be taught. There are two very important things going on in this little vignette. The first is Mary's action in verse 39. This is what disciples do when they're being taught. They sit at the feet of their teacher and they listen. Mary's not choosing not to help Martha because she doesn't feel like it, or because she cleaned the house last week and now it's Martha's turn. She literally has something more important to do than be hospitable. Jesus is there and she needs to listen and learn. She's soaking in the wisdom that he has to offer. She's practicing discipleship in the way that speaks to her in this moment. The second important thing that's happening is the hospitality that Martha is busy with. In Greek, the word that's translated here as hospitality is diakonia. Other places in the Gospels, that word is translated in other ways that imply not only hospitality, but also ministry and support. Diakonia is the root word for deacon, an important role in the early church, as well as in many modern-day denominations, including the ELCA. Deacons serve as chaplains, in faith formation and youth ministry roles, in outdoor ministry, as teachers and preachers and servant leaders. The discipleship Martha practices is every bit as important as the discipleship Mary practices. In their travels around Galilee and now on the road to Jerusalem, Jesus and his companions are dependent on the sort of discipleship that Martha is offering. People who open their homes, feed them, and give them a place to sleep. But Martha is distracted by all of the tasks of hospitality, overwhelmed and upset by all of the things that are on her to-do list to make sure that Jesus and the disciples feel welcome. But Jesus is telling her, there's a time for that. And this is not the time. Now is the time for Martha to join Mary at Jesus' feet and listen. He has much to teach and not much time left to teach it. The story and the chapter ends here. We don't know what Martha's response to Jesus' rebuke is, but I hope that in this moment, she responds to Jesus' care for her. She has been trying to care for him, to be his neighbor, but she is the one who is in need. She needs to be reminded that sometimes the most radical act of obedience to God that we can perform is to allow ourselves to be cared for, to allow ourselves to feel God's mercy in our lives. In the Gospels, the people who are most receptive to Jesus are the ones who have a need, whether it's for healing, for forgiveness, or for someone to follow. We are all in need of God's mercy, and we are all conduits for God's love. Love God. Love your neighbor. For God. For your neighbor.